Hello, and welcome back to Impact Factor. I'm your host, Katie Van Aken, and this week's episode features the most specialist guest out of all the special guests. Her name is Dr. Deborah Van Aken, and she also happens to be my mother and one of the reasons I got my PhD. So I hope you enjoy our discussion. All right, well, let's get started. So,
Okay.
Debbie, can you start? Let's go back to the beginning. Can we talk about your undergrad into graduate experience? Can you just sort of set the scene?
Okay. Well, so I want to take us before undergrad because the scene began then. So, I'm old enough now, I get to look back all those years, right? So, um, it really started. It's funny because I remember in eighth grade doing the career, you had to do this career project and what you wanted to do. And even on there, one of my choices was to be a psychologist. So,
No way, for real?
yes. And I know it started when I read this book called Dibs in Search of Self by
Hmm.
Virginia Axline. And
Oh
she
yeah.
was a child psychologist. And I read her book and I probably read it a few times. And I might have been like late elementary or middle school. And I just kind of wanted to be her. She followed this one child and, totally exposed all her work with him. And I just thought it was really pretty cool. So that interested me. So I definitely knew I wanted to be a psychology major when I went off to college. So the program where I went happened to have a special program that was a psychology and education kind of double major. So because I thought, well, I didn't know if I'd want to go straight to graduate school and maybe I'd want to teach or something for something in between. And so I knew I wanted to work. I always knew I wanted to work with kids. And so I thought, well, I'll
Mhm.
get the education major as well. And I can teach for a little bit and then go to graduate school.
So let me ask you. So, you knew you wanted to major in psychology, but did you have any sense at that point, if you can remember, what it would take to be your the the psychologist that you wanted to be as far as like additional education? Like, were you aware of that at that point?
Well, yeah. I mean, yes and no. I mean, I don't know at that point that I had my eye on a PhD, but I had my eye on wanting to be a psychologist. And so I knew there would be graduate school.
Okay.
And I also knew that it's a little tough to do the kind of job I would be looking for with just a bachelor's degree. So I knew that there was going to be graduate. Um, but it
Okay.
evolved for sure.
Yeah.
And I can, talk about that now if you'd like.
No, it's okay. We can get back to it. I find it interesting because I think, I interviewed another one of my friends from Drexel who did the same, who came into her undergrad in engineering and committing to a BS PhD program. So she was acknowledging that she was going to be there for a long time and was going to get that, additional education. And I my experience was kind of different in that I decided later, and also a lot of people I talked to weren't even like really exposed to what second like the extra levels of graduate education was until partially through undergrad. So I find it interesting.
Think that's so. Remember, I had this book that I had
Yeah,
read that
right.
excited me, but I didn't really fully understand what it took to be her.
Sure.
So all I knew was I wanted to be a psych major. But yes, through the 4 years of college, you kind of learn a little bit about what it means.
Yeah.
What kind of options and the field of psychology is so broad with respect to the directions that you could go into. So,
Hmm.
it was still definitely a work in progress, even through those 4 years.
Cool. And while you were doing those 4 years, you were obviously taking psychology courses. Were you doing anything else from like a research or clinical work, sort of other things that might lead you into the PhD vibe?
Well, definitely part of the undergraduate work included, the research labs and the rat lab and,
Okay.
certainly the, statistics and all those kinds of courses, that fed, the the experimental psychology side of the psych major. And then my more clinical side was pretty theoretical, except that because I also was doing the education classes, I was kind of, my practicums were in the classroom. So, certainly it played out that way. I think we did observation in the preschool on campus and stuff. So there was a little bit of both angles, but definitely the research element came through my psych major too.
Okay, enough questions. Continue your story.
Well, the evolution. So, I mean, I didn't really have the plan to become a researchist, but I did enter this graduate program. So, I had to make the decision, do I go straight to graduate school or do
Mhm.
I teach? And even into my senior year, I was waffling on that. Um, but this is where, the history intersects with you, because I had at that point met what became my husband, and your dad kind of encouraged me to like just go for it, because already I had figured out that I didn't really love teaching in a full classroom. I preferred the one-on-one kind of experience in terms of a clinical room experience. So I knew I wasn't going to stay in education. So he encouraged me to just go to graduate school. So my next phase was to enter into a graduate program, but the program I chose, um, my eyes were on the idea of becoming a certified school psychologist,
Okay.
which in that department, in that program, therefore, was a master's degree plus a lot of extra coursework.
Okay.
And so then I still envisioned myself maybe in the education system, but my evolution there was, I also began to realize that I didn't really want to work in the school system. I really wanted to work for myself.
Mhm.
And therefore, to work for myself in the clinical field of psychology, it was best to go on and get my doctorate. And by the time I got certified as a school psychologist, it was basically essentially finishing all the coursework, and the only difference was a dissertation. So,
Between the masters and extra work and
between the
then the
master's
PhD.
plus and the PhD. So I had some mentors in the program, and they became, my sort of idols to where I wanted to go. And I decided to go for it and get the PhD so that then I could get licensed to practice, um,
So that's what I was gonna say.
in the
So
field.
so if you hadn't done the dissertation, you would not be able to do what you do today, and we'll get into that,
A
but
little a little bit yes and no. Because I'm that old, there's a little bit of grandfather. Actually, they were right on the cusp of changing the requirement to be PhD.
Okay.
Probably technically I could have gotten I technically took the anyway, I technically could have gotten licensed to practice with just a master's, but that
Okay.
probably would have had limitations
At that
through the
time
career. So I
of
was glad that I had gone all the way to the PhD.
yeah. And, you've made comments to me before, and I was hoping maybe you could expand on it, but, you were sort of feeling like the dissertation was the right decision, but it felt a little bit like a means to an end because you didn't really
Yeah.
need to train yourself in the art of research and a dissertation because you knew you wanted to end up in a clinical setting.
That's exactly right. So the program was the traditional PhD program, which means it's going to have that element of research. Um, but it wasn't my interest. My interest was more clinical, but we did have to do a dissertation that revolved around research, data collection, statistical numbers crunching, et cetera, et cetera. And, so that definitely the research part, which while well, you know what it's like when you're doing a dissertation. You start with an interest,
Yeah.
but by the time you're actually doing the dissertation, it's boiled down to such a tiny infinitesimal part of the series of research things that it's really hard to capture your interest. I mean, it really is hard work. That's
Yeah.
part of the toughness of a PhD program, right? Is staying, especially through that dissertation process. I found my path to be probably aided by the fact that it was a means to an end. I really totally knew what my goal was, and I just had to get through and finish the dissertation piece in order to capture the ultimate goal. So it helped me. It helped keep me motivated. It was helpful. And I look back and I kind of feel like it was a little bit fun because it was a piece of me and history, and it was
Mhm.
interesting. But it's not something at that time that I really had a whole lot of interest in. I definitely was more interested in the clinical experience and the practicums that my program required me to be doing, during bulk of the work, the PhD
Yeah.
work.
I'm hoping to get some um, students who are currently in a psychology PhD program or are recently out of one to understand if it's still like that, where if they have this sort of clinical aspiration, they still kind of have to walk through that dissertation process in the same way. I don't know.
I'm not sure. And there's two ways to get to the goal that I ended up with, and that depends on the program. So you've got your PsyD, PSYD, and your
Mm.
PhD. And it is my understanding that the PhDs, trended towards the more traditional model, that you're more familiar with. And a PsyD might be more practical, but I'm not sure of the status of that at this point.
And just while we're on this topic, I think it's interesting for listeners. Um, the difference between a psychologist and a psychiatrist is that you have a PhD, but a psychiatrist has to have a medical degree. Is that correct?
Correct.
And then therefore they can prescribe medication.
Yes, they're more likely to be prescribing medication, but they could do what I do too, but they've gone to
Okay.
medical school and followed that course.
Okay. But not required to be like an MD, PhD. They just came from the
Correct.
MD side.
They've just
Got it.
gone to medical school and it's like a specialization like surgeon or whatever would be a psychiatrist. Mhm.
Okay. Cool. So, do you remember and can you share with us a little bit about your dissertation topic?
Yes,
I
I
don't mean to
I
insult you by saying, "Do you
I
remember?" But
considered pulling it off my shelf. I mean, I'm this old that that dissertation was typed into my computer and not my computer, typed into my typewriter on the word
Wow.
processor and printed out in like multiple copies. And,
Talk about a
you
lot
know,
of work, right?
well, it was, right? So, the topic had to do, not unlike I think your experience. We went through our program, had the coursework, got to know the program and the different professors, and depending upon our interest or whatever, would connect with professors at some point to talk with them about their research and whether they had space to bring us in to help some angle of their research. And so that's what I did. And the angle and the research that I got into um, had to do with a topic around cooperation and competition between
Mm,
kids, and it was modeled around a task that the professor had sort of created for the purpose of 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 researching and observing cooperation and competition amongst kids. So you had two kids at a time working on a task together, and she had this metric for how to score them with respect to how cooperative they were being and how or competitive they were being as they worked
interesting.
together in the project. And the particular slant of my dissertation had to do with sibling pairs. So I had
Oh,
brothers work together versus sisters working together. And these would have been elementary school aged kids. And some of the unique differences that started to show a little bit, which would have required further study, which was not on me, but maybe on somebody else, was um, the fact that the girls were a little bit more competitive. The boys were more easygoing on this
really? That's
task
actually not what I
together.
was gonna
Yeah.
expect you to say.
Hmm.
Wait, competitive with each other.
Yes. Yes.
Oh,
And the boys were just a little bit more chill.
because I don't know. In my 30s at this point, I would argue that that is reversed. But
Yes, and there's so many other probably factors that come into play, and you know what it's like. That's what I said earlier. You're doing a research and you've brought it together to this tiny thing, and it doesn't all make sense until you do 100 other research things around
yeah.
it to really make sense.
And all you can do
So, and it was
is
a passing
publish.
phase for me. What?
And all you can do is publish and report on what you find, and then
Correct.
hopefully it fits into the larger puzzle of what everyone
Exactly.
else is
Exactly.
studying. Yeah,
Exactly.
very cool. Do you remember your defense?
I actually do, and it was very different than your defense,
Mhm.
because it was totally private. It was just me in the same room with my committee, which might have been, I don't remember that actually. I can't remember how many were on the committee. I feel like it was like four people in the room and it was just me and four people. So it wasn't as public as yours was.
Yeah.
And, they had, of course, read it, and you didn't have, I don't remember visuals like PowerPoint and stuff, that didn't exist in that world then.
Mhm.
So I probably did a bit of a oral presentation around it, but they'd read it. And then here's my experience, what made it easier for me. Um, it moved into a situation where the four professors started talking about the results
With
and
each other.
and with each other and
Yeah.
having a conversation and coming up with like their own ideas and trying to figure it out and yada yada. And I kind of sat back and listened to that.
Mhm.
And then it was over.
Yeah.
So
I've heard
it was a very gentle experience for
I've
me.
heard many stories like that. I think it's
Mhm.
fairly common and considered to be relaxed for the
Mhm.
defender in that position. Um, yeah, that's interesting. I mean, we've talked about this before, but at least in my experience, we had that interaction with your like closed door session with your
That's true, you did, yeah.
but you also have a presentation like a few months in advance of your defense. We called it our pre-defense. And so we would basically present everything in a less formal way, but basically this is everything I've done, you know, and I'm ready to go. And then that's when, they really start asking you questions and also like having those conversations. And then by the time you get to the public defense, like it's not a measure of if you're going to pass or not. It's
Right,
like
they wouldn't put you on a stage if it was
exactly,
gonna
it's
go
like your
there, yeah.
last
Mhm.
hurrah, which I liked because I think it was a nice memory to have with like everyone in the room and like this stuff that you've worked on for 5 years. But um, that's cool. I mean, it's cool that you also remember it too as being
For
a
that, I
pretty
can't remember all those other pieces that went through the process, like, certainly I had a proposal and I had to
yeah.
meet with the team at some point, but I don't remember those events, I just remember the dissertation. And,
What
we would occasionally we had some, um, Saturday symposia amongst our fellow classmates where we'd be presenting it and doing some of those practice
mhm.
rounds of, sharing results, etc.
Was it a pretty standard like 5-year time frame or was it more variable?
It was a little in my program. It was a little bit more variable because the program. I had a lot of fellow students who were, and even I too. After I finished my master's, I was working full time
Mhm.
um,
While completing the PhD part.
while completing the PhD. So for me, I did it in 5.5 years. I worked the first 2 years of my master's program was full time student, um, but a lot of the coursework had practicum experience, which for some people was sort of their jobs, and for me became my job, because these were folks that maybe were in schools or other clinical settings and were maybe furthering their their degrees, but were doing it while they were working. So the coursework was oftentimes late afternoon and
Mhm.
evening times, and then the research part was sort of on our own schedule. Um, yeah, so.
And I don't know if I've ever asked you this, but where like was there funding for the research you were doing?
No, that's the other difference, right?
Okay.
So, I mean, some of our employers and mine in particular, and probably many people's, gave a little percentage to the furthering your career path.
Okay, but
So
you paid for your
I'd get
degree?
some reimbursement from my employer, but otherwise, no, it was
Wow.
paid for by me.
That's even
I
more
don't
impressive.
know about the reality of that right now with PhD programs. It might be different in psychology.
Yeah, I think if from conversations I've had, I think if you are pursuing a traditional path and you're, assigned a research group from the beginning and you're doing research and you're working on a grant or whatever, you are funded. I would guess that there are fewer positions like that available in programs than in like the hard sciences and the engineering where there's a lot more grant opportunities. But I don't know. I don't know. Again, we got to get some people on here. We got to talk to
Right.
social
I don't know the
sciences.
landscape of that,
I just
and
have,
I'm very far away from that right now because I just
yeah.
have my clinical work that I do.
Okay, so very cool. So you complete after 5.5 years and you were already working full time. So what happened next? What did did your career trajectory change at all because you now had these three letters after your name?
Yeah, so that was at the end of all right, you can do the math if you guys want to know how old I am, but it was at the end, it was 1987. I got my doctorate at the same time, pretty much within about a 6 week span of time. I also passed my licensing exam. So
Mm.
in early of 88, I was able to I think I continued to work a little bit full time in my job, but I also opened up my practice. And then I began to, and then there was the point at which I quit the full time job and just had the practice. And that was in the phase of our life together when we were starting to have children. So it allowed for me to kind of work part time while I had young kids.
That's challenging too to start a practice in anything because you have to build your client base,
Right.
right? And so, I bet it's pretty normal to maintain your other job while starting a practice. And once you can sort of fund your lifestyle with your practice, then that becomes your full time gig.
If that's your choice, and or there's plenty of people that just keep a little part-time practice on the side. There's lots
Mm.
of variations like that, but for us, since I'm mine, this is the whole big picture decision making. It was a second I was the second career in the household, and so it was okay to keep that at a small enough, keep it part-time so that I could then, be the primary, parent at home with you kids. And I had 4 kids, and so, the practice stayed on the smaller side for a lot of years.
And you were focused on children at this point?
I
What
started
age
with
group?
children in my full-time job before. I was mostly children and adolescents. And so remember when I said I wanted to be a school psychologist. So part of my clinical work included doing a lot of um, testing, like intelligence testing, et cetera, for school
Mm.
placements or whatever. And so I did that. And my practice and experience evolved to include not just then the kids and the adolescents, but that's kind of from where I started with my job. But my practice itself moved into more the range of ages up through adults.
Um, uh, this question, I have an advantage because know it a little bit, but at one point you mentioned to me that you had the opportunity to move into the sports psychology world. And I
I
was
don't
wondering,
know that I had the opportunity, but it was
or
an interesting.
it was coming a
Oh, I
thing.
guess I did. Yeah, you're right. Yes, it was kind of a new specialization, and there was sort of a fairly quick kind of grandfathered in trajectory to get some certifications to begin to do it, work in that field. But I thought about it for a little bit, but I didn't pursue it.
Any regrets?
Uh, we take life from decision
Well,
point to decision point. It was a
I
decision
guess
I
let me
made. No,
rephrase.
I don't think about it anymore
Do you
because
still enjoy what you do?
I very much enjoy what I do, and I've become so busy. And as you know, I mean, partly because now that my nest is emptied, I have space in my calendar and day to see people early and later. And then COVID happened, and these last 4 years have been amazingly filled with lots of work and needs. And no, I haven't. I forgot about that, actually, the sports psychology thing. It was
S-
interesting a little bit
Stuck
because
with
I had
me,
at the time kids in the house that were doing sports, so it probably
right?
was an interesting topic. But yeah, it's fine that I didn't pursue it.
It's good. Um, so one more question about what you're doing now. So it's sort of obviously with your private practice, you can sort of it can ebb and flow, right? You can like increase, your busyness and you can start broadening your focus, I imagine too. And
Exactly.
do is is that flexibility something that you um wanted, or like is that a really important piece for you?
Well, it's turned into be very much so. I mean, I don't think I appreciated how nice it was when I delved into this, but
Mm.
I mean, there's other factors in play as well. But the way our family happened the way it did with 4 kids, and my my ability to stay part-time, and that was okay because we had a we were a two-career household, et cetera, that worked for that. So it did provide me great. In fact, this is true of some peers of mine who, women who ended up deciding to stay home with their kids and leaving their jobs and career paths. And um,
Hard to go
then
back.
at the point at which they were ready to re-enter, that was a little hard and scary, and for some impossible. And so they had to rethink what work would be for them. And I was able to kind of, I frame it as kind of foot in the door mode. I was able to
Yeah.
be in a foot in the door mode um, for those years when there was so much activity in the home with the kids and the schedules, et cetera. But I was able to, like you said, ebb and flow it, and had a lot of control over that. So it was really wonderful. And, you know, looking into the end of career phase, I could choose at any point, to back it down, but
Mhm.
keep connected a little bit. And in fact, in my field, I've heard that my field is one that people stay in for really long time past typical retirement age, because you can kind of do it as part-time as you choose to do it,
Yeah.
kind of thing. So yeah,
Huh.
it turned out to
So
be like,
interesting.
I don't know if serendipitous is the right word, but I definitely, we don't appreciate these things when we're 20 something, but it definitely turned out to be a really good thing for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and that leads me to my next question, which I'm pretty sure I know the answer to, which is, looking back on it, do you think doing the PhD was the right decision? And I mean, I'll let you answer, but go ahead.
Well, yes, I definitely do. And again, it was very much the means to an end, but the end was the right end for me. And so it has provided me all that flexibility. So yes, I've never looked back and regretted the PhD.
Because even if you didn't do that dissertation part, you could have been a school psychologist, or no?
I could have, and that was my plan, but I'm not sure that I would have felt as fulfilled in that
Yeah,
exactly as I do now.
yeah,
So, it
that's
just
good.
gave me more flexibility and
I always
more
love to hear of
autonomy.
I always love to hear of people who, when looking back on that question, are like, yeah, it was the right decision because it's a lot of work and a lot of years and commitment and you end up not starting your life until you're 28 or
Yeah,
older and so it's certainly much better to look back in that way. Um
definitely.
so while we look back, I've been asking this to many of the people I interview who are maybe closer to this point, but in time. But what were some challenges or something, like, surprising that you remember from doing your PhD? Something you, like, weren't prepared for or I don't know, something shocking?
I was thinking challenges, and then you said shocking. So I don't know about the shocking piece,
Well,
but
like,
the
either way,
challenges,
like, something I guess I lump them together, but a challenge would be something that you had to overcome, right?
right. Well,
Alternatively
yeah.
go
So the
ahead, you can
challenge
answer
for
that, yeah.
me, yeah. So specifically the challenge for me, and this is a bit of a lesson learned because I was a pretty independent person, and you kind of almost have to be when you're doing that dissertation. It's a pretty lonely experience. You have to really be able to, um, you really have to be pushing your own self through it, right?
Mhm,
So, and with that means to an end, that's helpful. But the challenge for me, and remember, this is back in the 80s, so computers were very different,
mm,
like a zillion times different than they are now. And the challenge for me was figuring out how to manage the statistical stuff and the computers. And I'm really fuzzy with the reality of this, and
mhm.
probably, your dad is in technology, so he could answer this question right now, but I definitely needed him to
Oh,
help me, because for some reason, somehow we needed to drive down to the school in order to use some tech computers there to run the statistical programs,
to actually do the research
to actually run it and spit
steps.
out, all those. Can you even picture this? But those green and white striped pages with those holes on the sides. I mean,
Oh,
can you
yeah.
picture that at
Mhm.
all?
I can,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm sounding like such a Luddite right now, but you know me enough to know that I am a Luddite. So that figuring all that stuff out was way beyond me, and I needed his help to help me run run the programs and make it work and make sense of that. And so it's a little bit of a fun memory because I remember just being so stressed out, and I remember him saying it was a Saturday. I think it was a rainy day, and he said, "Let's just," and we lived an hour away from the school, so um, let's just drive in and do it. And so we went. We spent the whole day. It was so draining, and it was so anxiety. I was so anxious because I didn't really know what we were doing, and how it was working. And he helped me, and then we come home, and we on our way home we stopped in at some restaurant, like some restaurant that doesn't even exist anymore, I think. And
Nice.
it was just one of those days where it needed to happen for me to finish what I was doing, and it just was really important. So that was a challenge.
Yeah.
um, that was the biggest challenge. And then of course the other general challenge is just continuing to push yourself through to the
Yeah.
end, because that's tough.
Yeah, it's interesting that you highlighted the sort of the support of your partner in the PhD. Out of curiosity, did you include him in your acknowledgments or anything? Because
Well, I'm sure I did.
yeah,
I'm sure I
I
did.
so I've sat through many defenses, where it's, thanks to my partner for putting up with this, because it sort of is like a team effort when you think
It
about it.
has to be. Hmm.
And I'm planning an episode in a few weeks that will be talking to a few people who are the partner of somebody who is getting their PhD, because I think there's also a huge learning curve in that role, um,
Yeah,
which and one of them is to, regardless of how silly it seems, offer to drive an hour to reduce the stress, and there you go. It's one of the memories you have,
exactly.
which is so interesting.
Yes, exactly.
Um, it's also so interesting that, like, I feel like maybe the 80s at that point was on, like, the cusp of technology becoming, like, a key part of this academic work, but not having been there for long enough where there were, like, people that could support the students in those tasks, right? Like, you had to bring somebody else along with you to help you do it because you weren't getting your degree in how to make the machine work, you were getting your degree in psychology.
It's interesting you say that, because as I was telling the story, I'm thinking, why wasn't there any resources? But I
Yeah,
certainly know that none of the professors would have been able to help me either, because
sure.
they were way older than I. Um, and it's not that we didn't understand the statistics and I had inputted all the data. It was all that. It was just making this program, and I forget you had to pay. I don't remember how it worked, but just getting it to run and print out,
Yeah.
and then there was it was tough. You're right. I don't know. Maybe I could have found it in house, but I hadn't figured that out. So luckily I had somebody close to me to help bail me out on that.
Yeah, but I mean, maybe not. I mean, even in my day, there were people who were experts at using certain equipment, and if you didn't find them, then you weren't running that at that point. So, um, I think that will remain a challenge for anyone in an academic setting where there's just like nuances around getting things to work, right?
But that's
Uh,
what we get our PhDs for, right? It's
yeah,
all sort of like learning how to problem solve and.
yeah. See my episode on the real skills of a PhD:
Yeah, right,
troubleshooting and
exactly.
debugging,
Yep.
and jerry rigging. All right, so um, I'll have one more. I have one more final question, but before we get there, I want to know. Well, I know, but I want our listeners to know a little bit more about you, um, outside of your career. And this can be like, hobbies that you did back then, or hobbies that you've picked up in the past years. But what are some fun things about you?
Well, stress busting activities are gardening, um,
Good,
swimming in the lake, swimming, mountain climbing.
nice.
I play the piano.
Did
Yep.
you Can you think back? Was there something that you would do to get your mind off PhD?
I can't think specifically, but
But
I
you
will
played
tell
piano back
you
then, I guess, right?
yeah, I would play the piano. Yeah, probably music. Yep. Some volunteer stuff. Always did volunteer stuff. That was always good,
Mhm.
um, working with kids in different places and yeah. But this is a bit of a story to tell. That kind of maybe fits in with that a little bit was a learning thing, and getting back to that story about your partners.
Mhm.
So I worked full time, as I said, and was doing the dissertation. And full time for me and the place where I was working required me to work 2 evenings. So there was a lot of time away from my partner. Um, and so what felt like it needed to be a 24/7 kind of undertaking to make all that work and happen, I would have the evenings when I was home. If I was studying, I'd feel guilty that I wasn't spending it with my husband. And if I was spending time with my husband, I was feeling guilty that I wasn't studying. And that was a very complex situation for me and us. And we talked about it and we made a decision to like literally schedule one night, which was my guilt-free study night. I already worked 2 nights, so you don't have that many nights left, right? But
Right.
one night was my guilt-free study night, and the other night was our my guilt-free date night. And we literally put that into the schedule, and it really made a world of a difference because it just erased the guilt stuff, right? So that was really valuable.
Right, 'cause otherwise you can't win, because whatever you're doing,
It felt like that.
it's always
So
guilt,
some of
so
the stuff we did on our free time was those date nights, became really
Mhm.
important. Go out for dinner um, in the middle of the week and stuff like that was just really, really helpful to both of us, obviously, but to the work that I signed up for.
Well, that's really good advice, and I'll probably quote it as I advertise this episode because I think there are plenty of people in that situation, and it's whether it's guilt about spending time with your partner or guilt, of I should be spending time with my family over the holidays instead of thinking about my research. Um, it's important to separate the two and give yourself a break
Yeah,
and
and map
let
out the
yourself.
expectation and say, I'm going to study this morning, but this afternoon, let's do this. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Um, all right. Well, I want to end with a question, which is, looking, which as I'm thinking about it now, like you just gave a pretty good piece of advice. But here, my question is, what is one piece of advice you would give to Debbie from, you know, early on in your PhD, looking back on it with all the wisdom you have now?
Well, hmm. Um,
It's okay if it's repetitive of something we've talked
Kind
about.
of, because the
Yeah.
advice would be that, like, make sure you take the time to take the breaks, make
Hmm.
sure uh, you take time to prioritize the holidays and the family. So that is a little bit repeating that, I guess. Um,
Because when you're in it, I think part of the I'm gonna say problem is not the right word, but when you're in it, you look around you and everybody else is also not taking breaks and not going home for Thanksgiving, and there's always people around you working on their stuff, their degree. And so y- when you start to work like 9 to 5 and you're like, well, people are leaving at 5. Okay, I can leave at 5, and so it's almost like a subconscious feeling of of pressure, but I think it's that therefore I think it's so important to continue to remind yourself and each other that the mental health break is so important in
so I
whatever
agree
way
with
it
that. I
looks.
mean, there's diminishing returns if you're going to study 12 hours in a row, right? So I just really believe strongly in, if you take a break, you're going to come back and be a little bit more efficient and a little bit more um, make more progress. And so the breaks are critically important. So absolutely. Uh,
Yeah.
Definitely my old age me tells me that breaks are really critical. So yes. And I didn't take enough breaks when I was young because that's what we do to ourselves when we're 20 something. So, yes,
Yeah. Yeah, it's good. I also think that just the general education around that, like mental health and everything in high pressure environments, PhD being one of them, is increasing even in
that's
the past
true.
5 years. And so that would be different
Yep,
than when I was in grad school too.
that's true. That's true. And more encouragement to take those breaks. I think maybe the other note to self is just, when you're in the middle of it, it's hard to imagine getting out of it, but it does end.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
does end, and you do get to look back, and it does become a
Yeah.
piece of you, and
Yeah.
one to be proud of.
Yeah. Well, that's my last question, but I wanted to give you a chance to plug anything that you want, for the listeners. Are you writing a book or something?
Oh, I don't know. I started a book, and then life hijacked me a little bit. So
So maybe at
stay
some
tuned
point.
on that. We'll see. It still is on my to-do list, but it sure is hard to get back to. Um, the
Well,
last
when
few
we
years have really kind of hijacked my time a bit.
well, when you do it, we'll get you back on the podcast and
Okay,
we'll talk about the book,
the book.
and that will be fun.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely. Thanks for your
and
support of that because it keeps me a little bit motivated to try to do that.
yeah, I mean, sometimes that's all it takes.
Yep.
Um, well, thanks so much,
Thanks for
Mom,
having me. This was fun. A trip
for
through memory lane.
coming on the show. I know
I
it's
wonder
it's
if you learned
probably
some things that you
I
didn't know
did.
about.
Yeah, and I hope it's a good experience looking back so many years later, but I also feel like you probably don't talk about this stuff very often in your day to day because it was so long ago and it's not really relevant to your job anymore, and so um I'm glad it was a good experience to look back.
Definitely. This was fun. Thanks. Thanks for having
Yeah.
me.
Thanks to Debbie for coming on the show. If you or someone you know wants to be interviewed on Impact Factor, feel free to reach out via Instagram and follow us for updates at Impact Factor Pod. Thank you all for listening and have a great week.